During London's blackout nights in 1942, when every window was darkened to foil German bombers, someone else used the darkness as cover. Women were ambushed in their homes and on shadowy streets, fast, brutal attacks that ended as suddenly as they began. The newspapers named him the Blackout Ripper, a killer who seemed to dissolve into the wail of air raid sirens and the ink-black city. If you want that full case, it's on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. I grew up in a little town called North Hatley in Canada, tucked along the north shore of Lake Massawippi. Picture-perfect place. Big old summer homes where Montreal doctors and lawyers came to vacation. Smaller lake houses with docks instead of backyards. Water stretching out behind them. For the first 7 years of my life, I thought I lived in paradise. Then, the day after my 7th birthday, a woman I had never seen before tried to kill me. It was the summer of 1957. Boats dotted the lake. The sun had baked the shore all day, and my friends and I were in our swimsuits, cycling between leaping off the dock out back and tearing around the front lawn. None of those smaller lakeside houses had backyards, just rickety jetties and docks, but whoever built them still insisted on front lawns, so front lawns we had. The lane along the lake ran just a few feet from where we played. Cars always crept by slowly, and being such a small town, drivers usually waved. Sometimes we'd know them by their cars, other times they were strangers from the summer crowd. That afternoon, we noticed a pale green Dodge Regent coming down the road. Naturally, we drifted toward the edge of the lawn to see who it might be. We didn't recognize the car, tourist, we figured, so we just watched it trundle along. Only it didn't trundle. As it drew closer, the engine revved and the car started to pick up speed. The sound made something in me step back on pure instinct. That tiny step saved all three of us, because a second later the Dodge jerked off the road, jumped the edge of the grass and came roaring straight at us. We screamed and bolted. I swear it was doing 60, maybe 70, chewing up turf behind us. If the driver hadn't been falling down drunk, she might have had the coordination to correct her angle and plow us down. Instead, she blasted past and slammed head-on into the big tree in old Mr. Finster's front yard next door. We thought we just witnessed a horrible accident. The car was a wreck, caved in around the tree, and when the driver stumbled out, she was streaked with blood from her face down her blouse. She looked younger than my mother, but older than my oldest sister, early 20s maybe. I remember thinking she was pretty, even through the blood. One of my buddies shouted, lady, are you okay?" That useless question people always ask when the answer is obviously no. I didn't know what I expected. A thumbs up, her collapsing, something normal for a horrible crash. I was not expecting what actually happened. She looked right at me. Her eyes locked on mine and filled with a hatred so pure it felt inhuman. For a second, just a heartbeat. That look was the scariest thing I had ever seen. But what came next was worse. Our eye contact must have lasted only a moment, but it felt elastic and too long. It snapped when she lurched around to the passenger side of the wreck. Behind me, a woman's voice cried, "Oh my God." I spun to see one of the neighbors from the big houses across the road standing on her front steps, staring in horror at the crash. I thought she was reacting to the mangled car and the injured driver. She wasn't. When I turned back, I saw the woman in the bloody blouse dragging a long gun from the passenger seat. At that age, I thought every gun was a rifle. I didn't understand that the weapon she was yanking free was a double-barreled shotgun, and that she only had 2 shells. All I understood was that she pointed it at me. She wobbled as she raised it, but when those dark muzzles lined up with my chest, a cold certainty went through me. I'm dead. Her first shot went wide. The explosion of sound kicked us into motion and we tore toward my house, screaming. I was sure she'd keep firing until she hit us. I didn't know she had only 1 shot left. Instead of taking that shot, she lowered the shotgun and started running at us. Nobody was home at our place. My mom and older sister had gone for a walk. They'd told us, apparently. We hadn't heard. I'm grateful for that to this day. I hate to imagine my mother or sister opening the front door to that woman and giving her 4 or 5 of us in one easy cluster. Seeing her closing the gap, we abandoned the front door and sprinted around the house toward the dock. The lake was our only escape. We ran flat out, waiting for the next blast at our backs. It didn't come until we were already in the water. I hit the lake feet first, plunged down toward the sandy bottom, and heard a muffled boom ripple through the water above me. For a second I was convinced I'd been shot and just couldn't feel it yet. I checked my legs, my sides, my back in the green murk. Nothing. No blood, no pain, just the dull ache of needing air. I stayed down as long as I could, terrified to surface. Eventually my lungs forced the issue. I broke the surface with a huge gasp and blinked water from my eyes. On the deck, one of our neighbors had the woman pinned. I saw him wrench the shotgun from her hands and hurl it into the lake, then shove her hard down onto the boards. "Anybody hurt?" he called. We gurgled back that we were fine. The woman was not. She shrieked and thrashed, injuries from the crash made worse by being slammed onto the deck. She sounded wild. Our neighbor shouted at us to go get help, but before we'd even hauled ourselves fully out of the water, another man came running from down the shore with a rifle. He didn't realize the woman was already disarmed. "Call the cops," our neighbor barked at him, still pinning her. The man with the rifle turned and sprinted back the way he'd come. "Get back to the house," our neighbor told us. "Out of sight, now." We didn't argue. We crept around the far side of the house, out of her line of sight, and waited, listening to her hoarse screams until the police finally arrived and took her away. When my mom got back, she nearly came apart. From her point of view, she'd gone for a peaceful walk, and in that short span, some deranged stranger had tried to run down and then shoot her son and his friends. She felt like she'd failed us by not being there, but the truth was, we were lucky she hadn't been. The woman hadn't come for random kids on a lawn. She'd come for us, specifically for me and my older sisters. The only reason no one but her was injured was a series of small, stupid miracles. Back at the station, once she sobered up, the woman answered every question. She told the police about the affair she'd been having with my father, how he'd promised to leave his wife and children, us, and run away with her, how he'd changed his mind one day and decided he was better off where he was. She'd warned him if he did that, she'd kill his family. He'd laughed it off, told her she'd do no such thing. She told him she was serious. He still didn't believe her. She got angrier and angrier, until one night she raided her father's liquor, got herself drunk, took his shotgun and his car, and drove across town to make good on her threat before she lost her nerve. That's what I mean when I say we were lucky. If she hadn't been so drunk, she misjudged the turn and put that car into a tree. If she hadn't smashed her head on the steering wheel, there's a good chance I wouldn't be here writing this. At first, the police told only my father why she'd done it. He decided not to tell my mother. That didn't last. Word has a way of getting out, and when my mom finally learned the full story, she and my dad had the biggest fight of their lives. It was also their last. Shortly afterward, my mother took us, me and my 2 sisters, south across the border to the United States. We lived in New York City for a while, then moved out to Long Island when she remarried. We didn't get the rest of the story until years later. The woman went to prison, and my father drank himself to death once he fully grasped that his cheating had nearly gotten his wife and children killed. I know it wasn't him who pulled the trigger or stomped on the gas, but I can't help thinking none of it would have happened if he'd kept it in his pants. Sometimes I think about him at the end. Was he tortured by what he'd done, reliving it in every glass? Or did he finally find a mix of booze that kept the guilt blurred enough to fade out without a clear thought in his head? I try not to pity him, because somewhere in another version of events, he's drinking himself to death beside 4 fresh graves. Mine, my mother's, and both my sisters. Hey Joel, my name's Kieran and I'm from Glasgow. When my granddad was still alive, God rest him, he told me a story I think you'll appreciate. He moved to Glasgow as a teenager in the 1940s so his dad could get work at a munitions factory during the war. but he'd grown up in a wee coastal village called Stoin. The name comes from the Scottish Gaelic for nose, and if you look at it on a map, the peninsula really does jut out like a big schnoz. Don't let the funny name fool you, though. I've visited Stoin with my granddad, and it's beautiful, but it also hides a very dark secret, or rather, an open secret these days. My granddad only shared it with me after a few too many drams of whiskey. Back in the early 1900s, before the First World War, Stoin was pretty much what it is now, just smaller. A charming little village hugging the shore road, full of smiling folk who'd nod or say hello as they passed. The town kind of straddles a lovely golf course, which meant a steady stream of wealthy visitors. They filled the cafes and pubs, lightening their wallets and keeping everyone happy. Life was peaceful enough that the village constable did little more than wander about whistling. Until the night the post office burned down. It was first seen on fire just after sunset one October evening. Villagers rushed with buckets and whatever they could grab, but the blaze had too much of a head start. By morning, the post office was nothing but smoldering ruins. Fearing that the postmaster and his 2 assistants had died inside, Constable Mallister picked 2 solid, trustworthy men to help sift through the ashes. When they were done, he called a meeting and delivered what he framed as good news and bad. The good news: no human remains had been found. The postmaster and his assistants must have escaped the fire. The bad news: they appeared to have taken more than £1,000 from the post office savings bank with them. The supposed culprits were the postmaster, Mr. Douglas, a middle-aged bachelor, and his 2 assistants, Mrs. Robertson and Mrs. Mackenzie, both spinsters. None of the 3 had any family in the village, so in the constable's telling, they'd had nothing tying them down. The revelation rocked Stoin. It was the biggest scandal since the 1700s, when a gang of smugglers murdered the village officer landing contraband on the shore. At the Sunday church service, the vicar invited Constable Mallister up to address the congregation. He assured everyone he was doing all he could to bring Douglas, Robertson, and Mackenzie to justice and recover the stolen money. He was even liaising with the police in Glasgow and Belfast, and officers in Glasgow believed they were close. Less than a week later, he stood up again with good news. Police had just raided a house in Clydebank thought to be the trio's safe house. The 3 had apparently fled only minutes before, but they'd left behind a sack full of banknotes. The savings money, Mallister announced, had been recovered. Naturally, the village erupted in celebration. The pubs did a roaring trade toasting the post office's good fortune. But it was all a lie. The truth didn't surface for another 25 years, when one of the 2 men who'd helped Mallister sift the rubble lay on his deathbed. Mallister himself had already died of a fast-moving cancer, seemingly determined to take the secret to his grave. One of the men he trusted to do the same could no longer keep it. The dying man said he felt deep remorse for helping blacken the names of 2 innocent women. Mrs. Mackenzie and Mrs. Robertson had not stolen anything. In fact, there had been no theft at all. According to him, here's what really happened. Most of the town had been up half the night trying to fight the post office fire. Exhausted, they'd finally stumbled to bed. At first light, with the village still asleep, Constable Mallister and his 2 hand-picked helpers returned alone to the smoking ruins. That's when they found the bones, 3 sets of charred remains. The postmaster and his 2 assistants had died in the fire after all. The men couldn't understand why the 3 hadn't escaped. The post office was a small building. Surely they'd noticed the flames early enough to get out. Closer inspection only made things stranger. Both doors were locked tight from the inside, and the keys were found in the pockets of Mr. Douglas's burned clothing. Baffled, Mallister left his 2 helpers to guard the scene and marched to Douglas's cottage, hoping for answers. He didn't have to search far. In the kitchen, on the table, was an extensive handwritten note. The letter was long and rambling, but its core message chilled Mallister to the bone. Douglas wrote that his 2 assistants were no longer who they claimed to be. He called them beings, not women, and said they posed a grave threat not only to Stoin but to the wider world. He claimed their powers were such that he could never defeat them in a direct confrontation. The only way to stop them, he wrote, was to lock them in the post office without raising their suspicions, set the building alight, and prevent them from escaping until the smoke killed them. Malister later told one of his companions that it was the most disturbing thing he'd ever seen written. The ravings of a madman, he said, and if anyone found out what Dalglish had done, that he'd murdered 2 innocent women and himself in a paranoid delusion, there was no telling what it would do to Stoin. A huge portion of the village's income came from that golf course and the wealthy visitors it attracted. If word spread that the local postmaster had gone insane and burned 3 people alive, who would keep coming to stay in the hotels and drink in the pubs, reputation carried enormous weight in those days. These days, people are all about talking things through, baring their souls, getting therapy. Back then, as my granddad put it, a stiff upper lip was worth far more than a wobbly lower one. Malister saw something else too. If the story got out, there'd be local legends of hauntings, kids traumatized for generations, and nosy penny dreadful journalists sniffing around. The village would be known not for its beauty and golf, but for a gruesome murder-suicide. So he made an executive decision. He buried the bodies quietly. He hid Dalglish's letter. Then he invented the theft, framed the 3 dead people as thieves on the run, and spun a story of Glasgow police hot on their trail. The Clydebank raid and recovered money were staged to tie it all off neatly. He sacrificed the reputations of the dead to protect the living village. The dying man told his story to a few close relatives, and from there it spread in whispers rather than headlines. Some believed it, many dismissed it as a morbid rumor bored schoolkids passed around. My granddad, he swore by it, said he had proof. He told me that in the year before his family left Stoin for Glasgow, someone dug up Mrs. Mackenzie's grave in the dead of night. They didn't bother to refill it or put the coffin lid back. People woke to find the grave gaping open, the coffin exposed, and it was empty. Mrs. Mackenzie, whose body was supposed to have been buried after the fire, was not there at all. I grew up in rural Minnesota in the late 80s and early 90s. In some ways, my childhood was like any other kid's on the plains. We watched TV, went to church, even had a Commodore 64. But our TV was only religious programming. Church was every day and twice on Sundays. Even our Commodore games had to be scripture-based. We were part of an insular, extreme religious group, basically a cult, and that made everything different. We moved from one group to another until one day it was just us and my grandpa's little flock. The shepherd, the faithful, as he liked to put it. That meant my family and a handful of others living on a remote farm complex. Life revolved around the Bible and chores. Every morning at 5:30, we gathered in an old barn the men had painted black and turned into a chapel. There we knelt and prayed for God's protection as the end times supposedly crept closer. If someone got sick, we prayed more, a lot more. My grandpa preached total rejection of modern medicine, calling it the devil's crutch. Anyone who used a doctor or took medicine, he said, was wearing their lack of faith like a badge. 2 incidents shaped my view of all this, one that strengthened my belief and one that destroyed it. The first was the winter my little brother almost died. Looking back, it was probably pneumonia. He was burning up, barely conscious, coughing like his lungs were coming out. We all prayed around his bed while Grandpa laid hands on him, trying to draw out the demons. We fasted too, because Grandpa believed that penitence and self-punishment, what he called expiation, were powerful tools of healing. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, just anointing oil and whispered prayer. And somehow he pulled through. Grandpa proclaimed it a miracle. At the time, I believed him. Only years later did I realize it was likely just chance. We were indescribably grateful he survived, but not every child did. I remember 2 winter funerals before I turned 10, each with heartbreakingly small coffins. We didn't report births or deaths. I'm pretty sure Grandpa found ways to dodge taxes too. We had money, but it went toward indoctrination tools rather than any modern comforts. We bartered with nearby farms. My parents' generation was the last to have things like birth certificates or social security numbers. Outsiders were worldly, which, in our vocabulary, meant corrupt and dangerous. The faithless could be pitied and maybe preached at from afar, but never trusted, never befriended. Our little cloister had to remain pure. No public school, no unsupervised trips to town, no friends who didn't live on the farm. Daily life swung between simple joy and gnawing fear. Summers meant picking berries, swimming in the creek, bonfires where we sang hymns and shared testimonies. Winters meant huddling around wood stoves, memorizing scripture by flashlight when the generator sputtered. Christmas didn't mean trees or presents. Grandpa said the holiday had been stolen by greed. We had a special meal and extra-long prayers. Most of the day spent in that black-painted chapel thanking God for sending Jesus and begging him to come back soon and end this wicked world. People talk about the 90s as if everyone shared some big cultural moment. Seinfeld on VHS, MTV, the zeitgeist. For me, the outside world was glimpsed through a crack in the fence. We caught snatches of the first Gulf War on TV, which terrified us because Grandpa saw it as proof the end times were here. All those tanks and soldiers, he said, would eventually turn on us, driven by a government that not only rejected God but actively served Satan. The internet, when we heard about it, was just another way for the government to spy on believers. Ruby Ridge and Waco were, to Grandpa, clear signs that federal agents would kill people like us without hesitation. Y2K became his favorite sermon topic for months. We practiced hiding in root cellars with guns ready, convinced a raid was coming any day. When people from older generations talk about duck-and-cover drills and fear of Russian nukes in the 50s, I know what they mean. I grew up in that same thick air of dread, only our enemy wasn't the USSR. It was everyone outside our fence. The second incident, the one that broke my faith, happened in the fall of 1997, just before my 15th birthday. My grandma was making dinner for Grandpa when she suddenly attacked him with a knife. He claimed it happened for no earthly reason. I don't buy that anymore. I think he said something cruel enough to finally push her over the edge. I don't know what it was, that's pure speculation. But whatever happened, something in her snapped. I saw her as they dragged her away. A group of men hauled her struggling body out of the house, heading toward the chapel. She was kicking and clawing, screaming words I couldn't make out. They had a cloth wrapped around her head to keep her from biting. I only recognized her dress. Everything else about her, the snarls, the contorted face, seemed like a stranger. I ran to my mother, sobbing, asking what was wrong. She didn't know. Later she told me, Grandma was possessed by a demon. Watching her hauled off to be shackled to a bed in that black barn was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. And yet, weirdly, I was hopeful in the days that followed. After all, hadn't we prayed my brother back from death's door? We had Grandpa, the great shepherd, praying over her day and night, plus the entire community begging God to heal her. Surely she'd be okay. We couldn't use the chapel anymore. It was her prison now. On Grandpa's orders, we prayed in our houses instead, asking God to forgive our sins and cast the demon out of Grandma. I truly believed it would work. Instead, she got worse. She slept through the day. At night, we heard her screams. The barn was a good distance from the houses, so it was more like a constant, ragged wail on the edge of hearing. That went on until she either passed out or shredded her voice around dawn. There are things I learned only much later, because the adults didn't share everything with us. But one morning, Grandpa came back from the barn looking like a ghost. He was usually exhausted after a night at Grandma's bedside, but this time he looked defeated. He quietly told my dad, his son-in-law, that he'd learned something during the night that terrified him. To explain that, I have to give a tiny theology lesson. Leviathan, in fundamentalist demonology, is a big deal, one of the princes of hell. In the Bible, it's described as a sea monster covered in impenetrable scales, breathing fire like a dragon yet living in the deep. From that perspective, Leviathan is the last entity you'd ever want possessing someone you love. Those scales supposedly make it impossible to drive out. Its fiery breath symbolizes a horribly corrosive effect on the victim's body and soul. Here's the crazy part. At first, Grandpa was thrilled. He was convinced Grandma's demon was Leviathan, and he believed, without question, that God would give him the power to defeat it. In his mind, he was a chosen vessel on the righteous path. There's even a prophecy about the torturous serpent being served up to the righteous at the end of days. Grandpa decided he'd been given the honor of helping usher in the apocalypse by battling Leviathan itself. For a true believer like him, hastening the rapture was the best possible outcome. But as Grandma continued to deteriorate, his certainty curdled into terror. If Leviathan was going to claim her soul, it meant one thing to him. God had judged him unworthy of that honor and withdrawn his favor. And if God had deserted Grandpa, then he deserted all of us. I didn't know any of this at the time, but I could feel his fear. It was in his sermons, which got more frantic. In his face, more lined and haunted after each night of exorcism. Most of all, we felt it when he had every man, woman, and child form a circle around the barn one night, praying aloud for Grandma's soul while she screamed inside. She shouted herself hoarse during that prayer ring. "He's the devil. You need to get out. Get far away from here," she shrieked. At the time, we took those as the words of a demon prince. Now I think they were the truest words I ever heard. After the prayer circle, we went home and prayed some more, trying to pretend we couldn't hear the blows. Grandpa had escalated from laying hands on her to literally trying to beat the devil out. Weeks later, my parents told me it was time to say goodbye. We lined up outside the barn and went in a few at a time. Inside, it was quiet. Grandma no longer had the strength to scream. She lay on a filthy mattress, eyes open but unfocused, breathing in shallow sips. If she recognized us, it didn't show. Looking back, I think Grandpa had done something terrible to her mind on top of everything else. Starved her, beaten her, broken her. She didn't speak, just stared past us as each of us tearfully said goodbye and shuffled back out. Grandpa stood by the door the entire time, eyes empty. He looked like a man whose God had abandoned him. After Grandma died, we dug another hidden grave in our secret cemetery and held a small funeral. Then Grandpa retreated into what he called a season of prayer. Every day he went into that chapel and knelt by the mattress where she'd wasted away. We thought he was praying for her soul. I think he was starving himself and trying to make sense of his life. He dropped weight. His sermons grew shorter and rarer. We saw him outside less and less. Then one morning he got up before dawn, walked into the woods, and never came back. My dad, who as the male heir took over leadership, told everyone Grandpa had been taken up by angels to be with Grandma. I have my own guesses. None of them involve angels, but no body was ever found. For a while, life went on as before. But without Grandpa's iron grip, my dad slowly eased some of the stricter rules. One big reason was practical. We needed a lawyer. Someone floated the idea of sending one of us kids to college, pay for their schooling together, and in return that person would come back as the farm's in-house attorney. Since I was the oldest and, frankly, the best student, they picked me. The plan was simple. I'd attend a private Christian college. They weren't about to let me anywhere secular, get my law degree, then return to defend the farm. That was their plan. Reality went another way. If watching what they did to Grandma planted a tiny seed of doubt in me, college dumped a bucket of water on it. Coming from a fundamentalist homeschool into any kind of real academic environment was like stepping into sunlight after years underground. I still believed in God, sort of, but I started learning about other Christian traditions and even older philosophies. Gnosticism, Mandeism, Manichaeism. I began questioning not just Grandpa's teachings, but everything I'd been told. The more I learned, the more I realized Grandma hadn't lost her battle with a demon. She'd been murdered. By the time that sank in, Grandpa was long gone. I couldn't see justice done there, but other people had played a part in her death, my parents among them. In the middle of a deep depression, with my worldview in pieces, I did the only thing I could think of. I called the sheriff's office back home and told them everything I knew. Deputies made the trip out, asked questions, and concluded there was almost no chance of securing convictions. The main culprit was dead. The others would say they'd done what they thought was right. I'd expected as much, so it wasn't a crushing blow. What mattered to me was drawing a line. I was already planning to cut contact with my family until I could sort myself out. Having the cops show up on their doorstep was a kind of legal punctuation mark on that break. Soon letters from my parents started appearing in my campus mailbox. I could feel the tension in my body just seeing the envelopes. I denied having called the authorities, at least until I graduated. I couldn't risk them pulling financial support before I had my degree. After college, I worked, saved, and eventually had enough to pay them back every cent of tuition. Only then did I sit down and write the hardest letter of my life. I confessed that I was the one who'd reported Grandma's death. I told them why. I included a check for the full amount they'd spent on my education, and I added a postscript explaining that I was moving somewhere they'd never be able to find me. I sometimes imagine my father reading that letter, red-faced with fury. Furious or not, he cashed the check. With that, I bought my freedom. I still believe in God, but not in any way my grandfather would recognize. I honor my father and mother by praying for them when I can, hoping they someday see the harm they've done. I don't know if that farm still exists, or if they've softened or doubled down. I just know I can't sit at the same table with a man who helped torture his own mother to death and call it love. I can't tell you my name or exactly where I am now. I can tell you I'm a young woman who grew up in a tiny Siberian village called Pashina. Pashina had around 500 people in it, most from families that had lived there for generations. We scraped a living from the land, while the rest of Russia raced ahead in politics and technology. Winters were brutal. Temperatures often dropped to 40 degrees C or lower. Snow piled up so high we had to dig tunnels between houses. We burned wood or coal in our stoves just to keep from freezing. Sometimes people left their car engines running all night so they wouldn't seize. Summer was kinder but not easy. In midsummer the sun barely set, and the constant light made sleep difficult. Mosquitoes came in clouds, leaving us covered in bites. But summer also meant berries to gather, fish to catch, and a brief chance to fill our stores. Even in the easy months, everything centered on survival. I was the oldest daughter in a family of 5 children, so I helped my mother from early on. I milked our cow, fed the chickens, split firewood. Our only heat came from a traditional Russian brick stove, so fuel was life. At sunrise, we baked bread and made kasha, buckwheat porridge, for breakfast. Our school was a single-room building a few kilometers away. We learned math, Russian literature, and history, which was really a blend of Soviet-era propaganda and horror stories about the chaos of the early 90s after perestroika. After school, I helped in the vegetable garden in summer, or mended clothes by candlelight in winter. We ate potatoes, cabbage, pickled mushrooms from the forest, and whatever meat my father could hunt or trade for. My babushka was a tough old woman who'd survived Stalin's time. She taught me embroidery and herbal remedies and swore life had been better under Papa Iosif. We didn't have internet until 2011, and even then only at the community center. Electricity was spotty, blackouts were normal. Sometimes we went days with no TV or radio at all. As a teenager, I saw pictures and videos of big cities online, Novosibirsk, Moscow, and dreamed of leaving for university or a job. But for a girl from Siberia without connections or money, that dream felt far away. I got my wish in the end, just not the way I imagined. We have a saying in Russia that's close to an English one: be careful what you wish for. One winter night in 2022, the whole village woke to a distant, thunderous explosion. It sounded far overhead, like the sky itself had cracked. A few seconds later, a shockwave rolled over us, rattling windows and walls. I heard children crying across the village. I called to my papa, asking what was happening. He didn't know. He pulled on his boots and coat and ran outside. We all poured out after him, some barefoot in the snow, half-dressed, craning our necks. Above us, the sky burned. A massive fireball glowed overhead, so big my mind struggled to understand it. It turned the night to bloody daylight like hell had pushed through the clouds. Thick, dark smoke billowed from it, swallowing the moon. We watched, stunned, as the flames dimmed. Then the debris started to fall. At first it was just small pieces, clattering off roofs like strange metallic hail. Then came the larger chunks, heavy, shrieking through the air, trailing fire. We dashed back inside as bigger pieces started slamming into roofs and yards. My mother and father threw themselves over us kids as something crashed through our roof and burst into flame on the floor. I remember my father grabbing a blanket, soaking it with water and slapping it over the burning metal. The room filled with choking smoke, but he smothered the fire. He saved our house that night. Others weren't so lucky. By morning, 8 people were dead and nearly twice as many homes had burned or collapsed. We stepped outside and gasped. Roofs torn open, blackened timbers, smoke rising from the ruins of neighbors' houses. We were used to fending for ourselves. In Pashina, you didn't expect help from the authorities for weeks, if at all. So when a column of soldiers arrived that same day, we were surprised and relieved. The relief didn't last. The first thing they did was order us to stop cleaning up. They weren't there to help rebuild. They were there to get us away. They said it was too dangerous to remain in the village. If we came with them to a temporary camp, they'd feed us and treat the wounded. Once it was safe, they promised, we'd return and our homes would be repaired. That at least they did. The camp had tents, cots, regular meals. Military medics dressed burns and broken bones. We were each called in to speak with the same pair of officers. They were kind, even sympathetic, as they asked what we'd seen in the sky. They repeated that engineers were already at work in Pashina and we'd be home soon. But something in their behavior felt off. Soon we noticed people being summoned back to the medical tents over and over. Not just the severely injured, everyone. Each time they had blood drawn, their bodies examined from head to toe. No one was allowed to refuse. They were testing us for something. They would not say what. Weeks passed. We lived in rows of identical tents, ate army rations, and submitted to endless tests. Finally, frustration boiled over. A group of villagers confronted the officers, demanding to know when we'd be allowed to return. The officers claimed the engineers still hadn't cleared all the dangerous debris. The area was not yet safe. My father pointed out that with everyone working together, we could have cleaned and repaired the whole village in a week. The army had supposedly been at it for 3 weeks with no visible progress. They told us they'd figure something out. We thought that meant finally sending us home. Instead, they announced we were being relocated to a suburb outside Moscow called Mytishchi. We were herded onto trains and trucks. After days of travel, we arrived at our new home, a tall, gray apartment block surrounded by more just like it, except ours was ringed by a fence and guarded. The ground floor had been converted into medical facilities. Technically, we were free to come and go. In reality, leaving required a labyrinth of approvals from military bureaucrats. Almost no one succeeded. The pattern repeated. Same bland food, same tests, same interviews about the explosion, only now with different officers asking the same questions again and again, as if hoping we'd suddenly remember some crucial detail. I told them the same thing every time. A boom in the sky, a giant fireball, debris, terror. There was nothing more to tell. Weeks turned into months. Word trickled down that Pashina had finally been rebuilt, the debris cleared away. Yet every time someone applied for permission to leave, there was another excuse. Wrong form, incomplete fields, missing signature, my father kept trying. Every time some new problem. One night I heard my mother crying, whispering that we would never leave that place. Then, one afternoon, my father came back to the apartment beaming. We were leaving. He told me the rest later. One day in a stairwell, he'd stumbled onto two guards doing something they definitely weren't supposed to be doing. He didn't specify what, only that they'd be in deep trouble if their superiors found out. The guards asked what he wanted in return for his silence. Apparently, we were too special to simply make us disappear. Instead, my father told them he wanted exit permits for his family. The next time he applied, they were miraculously approved. We were only the third family from Pashina allowed to leave that building. My father soon met the father of one of the earlier families. The man warned him that leaving the block did not mean we were free. He'd gotten a job as a garbage collector to save money to go back to Pashina. The government wouldn't pay for his travel. Another sign they didn't actually want any of us going home. Worse, he noticed he was being followed whenever he left his cheap rental flat. Sometimes two men in a car, sometimes a man on foot, but always eyes on him. That was all my father needed to hear. He decided we would not be going back to Pashina. We would be leaving Russia entirely. I can't say which country we're in now for safety reasons, but we were able to tell our story to officials and request asylum, arguing that we'd been held and experimented on without consent. My father said the officer who first heard him out was visibly shocked, even angry, at what had been done to us. We're still waiting on our final decision, but we've been allowed to stay while the process continues. Another man from the government asked detailed questions about the explosion too, what we saw, what we heard, how the debris looked. My father gave him the same simple story he'd given the army. Sometimes I lie awake worrying our claim will be denied and will be pushed into another camp in another country, living in limbo again like we did in the tents and the apartment block. But that is only my second worst fear. My greatest fear is that we'll be sent back to Russia, or that Russia will come here for us. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Tap that notification bell so you don't miss future narrations. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we have live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Got a story you want to share? Email it to letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might hear it featured in an upcoming video. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to see the extra perks for channel members. Don't forget to check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear these stories in big compilation episodes anywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you're into true crime, I've got a channel for that too, Saturn Soul. The link's down below with the latest video. Thanks so much, friends, and oh yeah, Happy New Year.